I'd like to begin today by asking a simple question. Does gender matter? Does gender matter? Is it really the blurry line that many postmodern scholars proclaim it to be? Is gender something simply that is slippery and difficult to identify? Are the words male and female old words that box people in too tightly? Isn't gender actually really confusing? And isn't that why we need at all of our colleges today the major known as gender studies? Many people ask such questions today, and it is critically important and critically urgent that we understand where the church comes down on this. We are in a period of crisis. I think we are all safe in admitting that. And this crisis is perhaps unlike any other that we've ever faced in history before. It seems like we are flying in an old and rickety airplane, and the plane is starting to shake, and pieces of the plane are starting to fly off. It looks like things are coming apart in all directions. I want to propose to you then that something that our world is desperately in need of in the midst of this crisis is Catholic Christian masculinity. But what is that? What does the church have to say about masculinity? While the gender scientists say that gender is really just an anatomical difference, the church is actually very clear. Pope Benedict just recently reminded the bishops that gender isn't just physical, but it is also psychological and spiritual. It is also, the Pope notes, ontological. That means it goes to the core of who I am. My masculinity is in the very fiber of my being. It's at my core. If I try to deny that, the church says, then things will go terribly awry. As Catholics, we have this idea that is roundly mocked today called the natural law. The natural law says that things are made with a nature. And if things try to deny their nature, disaster will ensue. For example, if I try to run a nuclear power plant like it runs on coal, there will be a nuclear meltdown. If I try to use a raft as a parachute, I will hit the ground. If I try to use a parachute to navigate Class 5 rapids, I will die. In the spiritual realm, we are also, along with that same idea of natural law, we are made to be children of God. It is in our nature. If we try to deny that, we become unhappy. Sex is by its nature open to life. When we engage in sex not open to life, things break down. If I am a man, but I try to rebel against what I am made, then disaster will follow shortly behind as well. The natural law. Things have a nature, and if they are not used according to that nature, or they do not operate in accord with that nature, disaster will ensue. Looking at this idea then of masculinity, how has it been understood in the mind of the church? There is one word that sums up the church's understanding of masculinity: sacrifice. My favorite movies are Glory, Gran Torino, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Dark Knight, Unbreakable, and Gladiator. What do all of those films have in common? And the films that I think most men identify with or would list them in their top 5 favorites. Those movies and those things that most men identify with have at their core the idea of sacrifice. Whether it's for family or for country, sacrifice is at the heart of what most men identify with. It's as if, as the church says, It's written in the very fiber of our being. Guys also identify with sports and tools and fighting, and all of these have at their core the idea of sacrifice, of protection, defending those placed in their care. We as men are hardwired for these things, and we are hardwired for sacrifice. It is the natural law for men to be concerned with sacrifice, with protection, with giving of oneself. Pope John Paul II notes that we see this when men look at their physical bodies, that our sexual organs are geared towards giving of ourselves to women. But again, that is not just simply an anatomical feature. Again, it finds itself at the very fiber of our being. We are made to give of ourselves to others and to sacrifice. We are called to be sacrificial then. But as with anything I am called to, I have to choose it. I am called to be a child of God, but I have to choose to follow Him. God calls me to be pure, but I have to choose to be pure. God calls me to worship Him, but I have to choose to go and worship Him. God calls me to be a man, and has written on me at the depth of my being everything I need to do so, but I have to choose to live it. Human beings are the only things created that can be less than what they are created to be. An ant can't choose to forsake its antness and decide to be an aardvark or a squirrel. And the same goes for trees and fish and the planets. They are what they are. We, on the other hand, can either put into action what is written on our hearts, or we can forsake what is written on our hearts. We can be shadows of what we are supposed to be. We have a call that is inscribed on our hearts as men to sacrifice, but we can choose to ignore that call. Part of what we see then in our society today is a loss of people living out that call to masculinity that has been placed upon them. We see an unwillingness or a shying away from sacrifice, and instead either toward one of two opposites, both of them extremes, both of them shadows, and in fact counterfeits of the masculinity and the sacrifice that we are called to. Some will choose one extreme in an attempt to flee from authentic masculinity, and that extreme is towards that of domination. Physical abuse, sexually only being concerned with one's pleasure as opposed to considering the needs of the woman, a lack of building up of those placed under one's care. Those are the symptoms, some of the symptoms, of that which is a false form of masculinity and a false form of sacrifice. The facade and the counterfeit of domination. Others, on the opposite side of that, and equally problematic counterfeit, would be that which is a masculinity that instead prefers to be passive, soft and effeminate. One that avoids that which is difficult, especially confrontation, leadership, and fatherhood. While something can be written on our hearts, it can also be the case that when a person is immersed in a culture that does everything it can to silence and even beat down and repress that which is written on our heart, a person can find it very difficult to respond to what is written on their heart. We know that when we're surrounded by a crowd of people who are not living the way that we know we ought, it becomes harder for ourselves to live that way. And I think that is surely the case with masculinity today. The effeminate, the passive, the whiny, and the soft on one hand, and its opposite, but equally problematic, unmasculine characteristics of domination, bravado, and arrogance and domination. When we are surrounded by either and both of those, becomes a spiraling downward for all those in society. When we lose those who are living authentic masculinity, and we see an uptick in those living the counterfeit versions of masculinity, that's not just a problem for men, it's also a problem for all of society. There are less and less role models for masculinity, authentic masculinity, thus making the opposites more and more pervasive, making it harder and harder for people to see authentic masculinity on display. I engage in what I like to call internet evangelization through blogs and the posting of videos. I try to confront challenging and relevant topics, and I'm convinced that masculinity is rare. Because when I exercise my spiritual fatherhood, many are shocked, saying things like, "Gosh, you aren't really nice." We have a totally warped sense of what it means to be a man today, and it is to the detriment of all in society. Again, we are communal creatures, and we do best when we see others as living examples of what we know we ought to be. It is easier to be a saint when living amongst saints, just as it is easier to be a brute living in the midst of other brutes. Our world then needs men. It needs men who are masculine, authentically masculine, who are oriented towards sacrifice and self-giving, which is at the same time absent of bravado, arrogance, and domination. Sacrifice is neither passive nor soft, although the demonic will surely try to whisper that into the ear of those who are sacrificing for the good of others, trying to discourage them and tell them that they're weak and soft. So as authentic masculinity is becoming more and more rare, where ought we to look for authentic guidance? One place we ought to look, I believe, is at the saints, especially as a time of Catholic persecution looks to be drawing nearer in our own day. I think we can take good role models from especially the early church when they were persecuted as well. St. Ignatius of Antioch wrote a letter to his friends on the way to his death, encouraging them to let the animals eat him to death and grind his bones into fine flour, encouraging his friends to not intervene. That is manhood. That is masculinity. That is sacrifice. Another great saint, in addition to all those who have endured persecution through the centuries, would be St. Joseph, a powerful intercessor for fathers and for men. As we heard in the gospel just proclaimed, we hear the story of when Mary was found pregnant with Jesus. We hear Joseph saying he was planning to divorce her. We hear the gospel saying that Joseph was planning to divorce her quietly. Quietly. Not calling attention to the scandal, not bringing further harm upon Mary, his bride, but simply planning to divorce her quietly. Another example that we can look to when we are looking for ways to live out sacrifice is to look at the Mass. Sacrifice is what is at the heart of the Mass. That's why we call it the holy sacrifice of the Mass. But sometimes, unfortunately, in our own day, we lose that notion of the Mass as sacrifice. And it can become, as Pope Benedict notes, a merely communal gathering. But when it becomes only a communal gathering and loses its notion of sacrifice, then men don't respond so well, which is why men are much more likely to miss Mass in today's American parish. When there is no sacrifice, there is no instruction for men, because men know that they are hardwired for it. And when they're not receiving it and it's not being talked about, men sense that at their core. Another place, obviously, to look when we're talking about sacrifice is to Christ. Christ, of course, is the perfect example of what it means to be a man and to be a human being. John Paul II's favorite passage from the documents of Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 22, notes that it is Jesus Christ who reveals to us what it means most fully to be human. He sacrifices, Christ does, but he does so quietly, like a lamb led to the slaughter, as the Scriptures note. Christ takes on the masculinity, that masculine notion of sacrifice, while also not pounding his chest, wallowing in arrogance or bravado. He's neither passive nor arrogant. He lives authentic masculinity, and we do well to look to him for example. What greater time, what greater opportunity than the next couple of weeks as well to focus on that sacrificial notion of what Christ did for us. In a week, we begin Holy Week. Christ's masculinity, again often portrayed as soft or sheepish, will be on full display for us as we recount again his entry into Jerusalem, his Last Supper with his friends, and his betrayal. Christ is often portrayed as weak or soft, but there's nothing soft or weak about what we remember these next 2 weeks. There's nothing soft or weak about allowing oneself to be bludgeoned nearly to death by those who captured him. There's nothing soft or weak about allowing oneself to be scourged at a pillar over and over and over again, especially when a person has the ability to stop that at any time. There's nothing weak or soft about allowing one's head to be crowned with thorns. There's nothing weak or soft about allowing one's arms to be stretched out on a cross and nailed in place, to suffer in agony for hours until no longer able to breathe, he gave up his spirit and died. There is nothing soft about what Christ does. Christ shows us as men the perfect example of sacrifice, of not being passive or weak, but of also not being arrogant or pounding one's chest or displaying bravado. Hopefully as well there are other men in your life who are good witnesses. If we don't have fathers in our lives, if we maybe have, our father passed away or we have not known our father or it's been an estranged relationship, hopefully there are other men in your life who you can look to as father figures, who can help you to understand and provide role models for you on how to live out authentic Catholic Christian masculinity. Hopefully as well we can learn from our priests. Hopefully priests are displaying authentic masculinity for others, just as fathers and other men in the parish are displaying and providing example to our priests as well. Hopefully it's a two-way street. Unfortunately, we sometimes see a decline in authentic masculinity among fathers, and we also see it then in priests as well. Just as it is easier for a dad to not discipline his kids, so it is a lot easier for priests to not preach contraception, to not warn against cohabitation, or any of the other difficult topics that a priest is to be raising from the pulpit. Or it's easy for some to raise those topics, but again to do them arrogantly, to do them without love. We must pray for our priests, just as priests pray for the fathers and the men in their parish. We must pray for one another, and we must call each other to continue to grow and to continue to develop our Catholic Christian masculinity. Our world is so desperately in need of more examples. Take people under your wing. Be an inspiration for others, and draw inspiration from those in your life as well. Finally, may we spend time here gazing at the altar and the Eucharist exposed there. May we draw strength from Christ's presence, He who is most perfectly Catholic Christian masculinity on display for all to see. May we sit in silence, allowing our hearts to be more closely conformed to His. May our hearts be melted into His through that fire of the Sacred Heart. And may we more fully conform ourselves to His masculinity this day, so that we may go forth providing a light to all of the world, a world that is so desperately in need of more men who are living out authentic Catholic Christian masculinity.